Hi, everyone. Welcome into the Buddhist Wisdom podcast. I have the fortune to be joined by my good friend, Lama Pema Dragpa again. Welcome, Lama Pema Dragpa.
Hey, Scott. It's good to be with you again. Thanks for sharing more time with me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for coming back for part two. Lama Dragpa and I decided we want to do a part two because there's just so much to discuss last time. And we also just spent 10 days at a wonderful transmission, a Buddhist transmission, Vajrayana transmission event in Mexico. And so a lot came up during that. So we thought, let's continue the convo. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing. Special times, really, really special times. Good to be with you. I mean, Good to have just shared a lot of time with you and family and friends in your local area of the woods. So thanks. It's things are turned on. It's good.
Yeah, it was nice to connect. So Lama Pema Dragpa, just to introduce him again, if you, for some of you who didn't hear part one, but you can go back and listen to that if you want. Lama Pema Dragpa has been a resident Dharma teacher at Padma Samye Ling in upstate New York since 2004. This is the main monastery and center of the Padma Samye Buddhist Center, founded by the Nyingma Dzogchen masters Venerable Kenshin Palden Sherab Rinpoche and Venerable Khenpo Sewang Dongyal Rinpoche. Ordained as a Lama by the Venerable Khenpo Rinpoche in 2010, Dragpa graduated with honors in philosophy and religious studies from New York University in 2002, and is a senior editor of over 25 books on Buddhist philosophy and meditation. He also regularly travels to lead Padma Samye Buddhist Center events on traditional contemporary Buddhist philosophy and meditation. Also, as some of you know who listened to or watched part one, Lama Dragpa is the author of a brand new book called An Integral View of Tibetan Buddhism, Preserving Lineage Wisdom in the 21st Century. And that's more or less been the subject of our conversation. And we're going to continue that conversation based on things that are in your book, Dragpa, as well as, some of our relationships to lineage, Tibetan Buddhism, our own practice. I also had forgotten until you reminded me here in Mexico that you were a monk also for 3 years. So that was kind of, I know we had talked about that before, but I had forgotten. So, not only are you a Western Lama, but also you were a monastic for some time. So, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So anyways, welcome back. And I thought we could kick it off with just starting to go into lineage. I think that was the end of our last conversation. Just really starting to talk about, why lineage, maybe is one question. What is lineage in the Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana lineages? And, why is it important? What's it all about? So maybe we can just start with that. And then if you want to bring in some integral approaches, great. But it's kind of kicking that off. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. That book I just came out with, originally the title was going to be Preserving Lineage Wisdom in the 21st Century. Yeah. An integral approach to Vajrayana Buddhism. So definitely at the core of my reflection with that is just the extraordinary specialness of Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana lineage. In so many ways. There's a little section on the book that tries to define what lineage is. It's about 10 pages long, and it's kind of a list of all these things that lineage really does.
I have that list, by the way, because you sent it to me. I could also read from that if you want.
Yeah, you can peek into some of it if you want. I think maybe get into maybe right off the bat, what's some heart essence Vajrayana lineage stuff, and then if we want to parse it apart, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
Yeah, so in general, the Buddha did say we have this totally uncontrived natural brilliance and goodness that is the true nature of our hearts and minds and of reality. And so the Buddha just very clearly taught that, and it can be distilled into wisdom and compassion, or it can be talked about to some degree as non-duality of just this naturalness we have. But the trick of that is it's so easy to say, and it's really difficult to just be natural, to just let ourselves flow in a natural way that aligns with the systems we're a part of, that honors and respects cause, condition, and effect, that like mutually boosts and cares for others and ourselves in the short term and the long term. It's all really hard to do and very easy to say. And essentially in a really big frame way, lineage, Vajrayana lineage, is all the supportive structures that help us to just be natural. It's all the conducive conditions that help us actually be courageous and be ourselves and just let ourselves beautifully be natural, be what we are. And in that process of actually kind of loosening up, like our very small, kind of narrow, tight, mono storyline experience of who am I, and to actually like have some more bright freshness in the room of my sense of me and my sense of us and what I'm a part of, with like to introduce some amazement. Lineage is when we actually do that deep unwinding, uncoiling, settling process that is practice in Tibetan Buddhism or in Buddhism, that can be a very messy, surprising thing. And there can be a lot of habitual patterns to resist that, because I want to be me and I'm not ready to be a fuller version of me, because those growing pains are usually kind of a little painful and stretchy. There's like carpet burn marks when the, reality kind of shows us a bigger view than what we're kind of used to. And so lineage is anything that helps support that easing into a bigger, fuller sense of me and you and us and what it is we're a part of. So that's a very general kind of definition of lineage. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think, I think the interesting question there is, we don't have to get into this right away, is like, what is that bigger vision from a Buddhist perspective of what quote unquote ourself is? And then I think that's interesting, because we have this in a lot of postmodernism and modern culture of like, I just want to be myself, man. Just let me be me.
My truth.
And yeah, it's my truth. Let me do it. And sure, go ahead. Like but the question is whether that's going to make one happy or not, whether that's going to fulfill one or not. That's really the question the Buddha asked. And so I think you're on. What you said, I totally resonate with, but I think that's an interesting question of like what that bigger me is, what that, maybe to throw something out there, it's like, does the self get so big it goes beyond self? Is there kind of this way where it gets, how do you say it? The bigger me is beyond me in a way, right?
Cool. So let's open it up. You're a deep dive Buddhist guy, and I like the deep waters and the shallow waters and all the versions in between. Like I'm a total fan of Buddha Shakyamuni and Guru Rinpoche, and so yeah, we'll go in there. So real quick, the four seals. They're said to be the four features of Buddhist teaching. Like any teaching is authentic according to the Buddha if it follows these four seals. And in Pali, anicca, dukkha, anatta, nibbana. So impermanence, suffering, no self, nirvana or nibbana, cessation. So these are really big topics in Buddhism. And without defining them with a lot of kind of nuance and granularity right yet, a cool thing that's really magnificently, radically awesome is that Buddha Maitreya in the Uttara Tantra defined the nature of reality as four other points. And those four other points are almost the mirror inverse of the four seals. So he called it not anicca, impermanence. He said great permanence.
Yeah.
Anatta, not no self, or anicca, dukkha, not dukkha, suffering, but great bliss. Anicca, dukkha, anatta, not no self, but great self. This is Buddha Maitreya. And then four, not nibbana, but great purity. And he said, these are the 4 qualities that if you recognize unconditioned awareness, that is Buddha nature, these are the 4 qualities of reality that will actually be the definitive teachings of reality, the like way an enlightened being sees things. And whereas the 4 seals then become provisional or approximate, or Cinderella stories, like Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche would say, stories, ways to make the sheer power of reality more digestible to minds that aren't really ready to see that clearly, that much truth. And so it's beautiful because the Buddha on one level said the conditioned awareness, conditioned mind, conditioned sense of me, this small me of 1 or 2 storylines that trace back to my history and my language and my gender and my traumas, that if you open that up and have a fuller version of that, actually more stories, more nuance, more texture, more ability, more time, more past lives, more potential, more talents, more connections, that it actually becomes not just impermanence, but great permanence. He said, neither permanent, beyond permanence and impermanence is great permanence. Beyond self and no self is great self. Beyond suffering and bliss is great bliss. Beyond impurity and purity is great purity. And this great here is an important distinguishing word. And usually it's said maha, Chempo. And that means it always points towards the open, flexible nature of reality, or the absolute nature, which sometimes is called emptiness. So what it's saying is that whenever you have experience and it's actually recognizing the empty, open, flexible quality of the experience, then it's signified by great. And then, for example, great bliss or blissfulness. It's a blissfulness or a sense of satisfaction or contentment that's not conditioned. It's actually when you recognize emptiness, the flexible, free flow nature of cause, condition, and effect, it's naturally restful, self-satisfied, content. So great blissfulness in all cases, at all times.
Yeah.
And so this is beautiful. I mean, that such a Buddha taught this on one level. The definitive truth was the 4 seals, but at a higher level, a more inclusive level, more closer to the nature, the Buddha nature of oneself and others, that same teaching becomes provisional or approximate or interpretable. And then the larger, more inclusive, more direct, more natural, more comprehensive teaching becomes definitive.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, super beautiful. And I think that's very helpful because I think, for us modern practitioners, because a lot of us get sometimes stuck in a misunderstanding of the 4 seals, or, a natural struggle with it, which is, I just want to point out, natural. I think I'm sure you struggle with them. I struggle and continue to struggle with them.
Yeah, still.
Because, for some, there's this idea of lack, or, if we're reflecting on impermanence, there's somehow some kind of like joylessness there. If we're reflecting on, dukkha is a real tough one, right? Because, it's asking us to look into the predicament of our human experience, and, where something appears as happiness, and when we question it in a deeper way, it actually starts to appear in a different way. We don't see that necessarily anymore. And this is tough. These are challenging, but I love that because I think I think what you're pointing out, and just to go back to our original premise, is lineage is a way leading to our natural nature, a way of to connect with our naturalness, or as Khyentse Rinpoche was pointing out this past week, our completeness. I'm really enjoying this word now in a different way, right? You and I and some others in specific lineages, we use that in a certain way, but I think we can even use it in this context, like great is a kind of completeness, that maha or chempo is a kind of completeness. So yeah, I love that. So
here's a real quick.
Go ahead, yeah.
So here's another way to define lineage, given that understanding of a sense of me that's actually becoming more full, more connected, more lovely, more Buddha nature full, more bodhicitta full, more compassionate and wise. So lineage is all the supportive structures that in that breaking down or breakthrough process of easing up that tight sense self of I'm only this, and it actually starts to expand and become a little more dazzling and surprising, even to oneself.
Yeah.
That like there's so much energy that comes with that, and there's also so many other subtle, quiet layers of patterning of fear, of hope that start to turn on and come out. And so that's a sticky, very kind of like growing pains process. And lineage is like, if we don't have supportive structures, wisdom structures that actually can help us be secured and safe and brave enough during that unwinding, during that opening process, then we can basically fragment ourselves. We can break apart. It can be too much newness, too much diversity in me, too many stories, too many options. And in that hyper fragmentation, that can get more and more fragmented. And then basically we have extreme postmodernism. Extreme postmodernism is take every single story you've ever heard and any kind of way of doing art and any medium and put it all in a blender and mix it all up and then drink it. And basically it's making everyone sick. So this is an extreme depiction, like, representation of it. But I think we can say that as these different systems and different parts of the world and different worldviews, strategies, ways of making sense, ways of making love, ways of making art, music, logic, there's a lot of different ways to be human. And as they all come crashing into each other, part of the challenge of now is that crashing experience is one of overwhelm. And so basically we intentionally, in one way, we can put on a bunch of blinders and all of a sudden try to build a lot of walls to protect ourselves from just too much. And so lineage is what helps us discern what of this fullness is actually valuable and creative and should be included and celebrated, and what of this fullness is actually just noise. It's not helpful for my process, for my creative, beautiful expression now. At the very least, it doesn't work for me. So I'll put it to the side and discern what actually is constructive for me, meaning how I can actualize my well-being so that I can be a better service to anyone I interact with.
Yeah, wonderful. I love to bookmark that and come back to talking a little bit about how postmodernism affects lineage and vice versa, because you're really hitting on some great points. And one thing I was thinking as you were talking as well around lineage is it's sort of like it just like anything, it's a container for our pursuit of truth, And I think in a way that creates some safety, it creates some context. It also, for me, lineage is community. That's like a way I define it often, even though usually we say that Sangha. Well, Sangha also can literally mean coming together, meeting could be a one definition of the Sanskrit word Sangha. But I think, to me, lineage, Sangha is also part of lineage, but lineage is community. It's something that's supporting, me in my exploration of the truth. It's also something, briefly to say this, it's something to bounce ideas off of, meaning there's feedback from lineage, where I think a lot of us, when we don't have lineage, we don't have feedback. We just have this kind of feedback loop of our own egotistical, self-absorbed ideas and thoughts. And we're trying to create our own truth. All the while our own truth is just leading us in circles, And
so that's a valuable aspect of a Buddhist lineage of wisdom and compassion would be, it functions in a way that any healthy, living, responsive, adaptive ecology functions. And that is, every ecology is within a larger system of ecologies that keep it in check. So once you have a system, a sense of me or an ecology, and there's nothing that's saying, hey, you're stepping out of bounds. Hey, you're taking too many resources. Hey, you can't take your things and put them in my room. This is my room. If there's no checks and balances, that becomes a cancer. It becomes a monoperspectival, basically a colonial project. And that one very powerful ecology starts to gobble up the surrounding ones. And so what lineage always actively does when it's in a Buddhist lineage is you're always in a larger system of checks and balances. So you're always in a larger sphere of interdependence. In middle way view of Madhyamaka, we talked about in this first session, there's always a larger set of causes, conditions, and effects that you're within and that are inside of you. So you're always made up of parts. So you have to pay attention to those parts and care for them, just like organs in a body. You have to pay attention to make sure they're healthy. And also, as a person, you have to be in healthy, responsive community or in touch with your living surroundings too. If you don't get the feedback from the surroundings around you, you might accidentally open the door to your car when you're driving on the highway and die. You have to check, hey, what's the container? What's the vehicle? Do I need a coat outside or not? Because if it's negative 20 degrees and I just don't get that feedback from the environment, it could just be a dumb, very preventable move. So lineage really helps that happen. And specifically in terms of a teacher-student relationship in a Vajrayana context or Tibetan Buddhist context, there's always going to be a teacher and a living lineage of teachers where you're always a student.
Yeah.
And that as a student, you always have someone who's guiding you. And the guide who is actually helping you out, helping you become your own master, helping you see things clearly for yourself, that guide is also always a student. And they're a student of a teacher that they have. And that goes back all the way to the Buddha. And this is a living lineage. They call it the stainless chain of golden mountains. And it's unbroken thus far, 2,600 years. It's a living lineage system. And that's a very it's a specialty of Vajrayana Buddhism in the world today. And so it's in part as a Vajrayana person, at the very least, and this is a minimum, don't break the living continuity of the lineage. And that means specifically anytime someone put in a position where they have to show up as any kind of a representative of the Dharma, they need to really be very careful because they're responsible for a stainless, uninterrupted living lineage that has led them to this point right now. And the next person that they communicate with, they're going to be in touch with that living lineage. But if it's distorted and I am irresponsible and don't honor that living lineage connection, it can actually break. And that's just tragic. And so at a bare minimum, we want to not do that. Do everything else, even if we just practice for 1 second a day of bodhicitta and goodness. They always say that. I mean, not to make it heavy off the bat, but Vajrayana can only be harmed from within.
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha, there's a prophecy from the Buddha, the Dharma, Buddha Dharma will be destroyed from within, not from without. I mean, actually, I think some lamas make a good point. It's, it was eradicated, outwardly, Buddhism was eradicated from India by Mughal invaders. And so, but it didn't kill the Dharma. It wasn't possible to kill it. And so, basically, you can't eradicate it outwardly, but inwardly, you can dilute it so much or confuse it or miss the point. And then, it's like a game of telephone. Lineage in a sense is a game of telephone. I want to point that out.
Okay. Uh-huh.
I think it kind of is. And I think, but there's also a container for how this is what we're talking about. There's also a container to make sure when it's being passed, there's something that it's getting worked against, right? It's not just like, hey, here's the, speaking into the telephone, the next person, and then it becomes diluted. There's something to then work with from there. And of course, as you pointed out, part of lineage is living teachers, living practitioners who are trying to embody these things beyond just intellectual ideas, trying to transform their way of being. I like to get into that too, those more subtle levels of communication. But yeah, there's a container for that, where I think when there's no container, when there's no living representations in a human body of what it looks like to be, let's just say, a realized being, let's just say that for now, then the game of telephone can get real weird. There's no way to pass it, and maybe that's not a great analogy, but I think a game of telephone can be useful if there's a container while it's happening, if there's checks and balances, like you said. I like that.
Yeah. One of my teachers, Venerable Khenpo Sewon Donyo Rinpoche, he always emphasizes that lineage there's two types. One is the scriptural type, where you can actually read tenet systems and actually do study and contemplation of the written teachings and the oral transmission of what the Buddha said, what Guru Rinpoche said, what are the reliable commentaries, the shastras on these teachings. You learn it. But the second part is where you learn what the living lineage is by being around masters who fully absorbed the meaning of those pointing outs or those instructions. And so what are they like? When do they pause? How do they walk? How do they make a torma? Like when do they start a teaching? When do they abruptly conclude a teaching?
Mm-hmm.
How does a line to the food counter? Like, how is that established? What all these are lineage, they're like living lineage. It's like the atmosphere within which wisdom dawns.
Yeah.
It's like the living local context that things happen within. It's not just a map that we memorize and think about, but it's actually putting ourselves on the line a little bit and having ourselves be shaped by what's happening around us. And like literally being that vulnerable to step into a space that some great teacher or some wisdom being has like designed for us to actually see more clearly ourselves. What is my mind doing now? What are my emotions doing now? What ideas am I having like right now? And a living lineage container is kind of like a very clear mirror in that way. And then it also says like, what are the beautiful ways that I can offer that I'm just not seeing yet? And so it shows us these two things, how we're holding ourselves back and all the beautiful things that we're actually holding ourselves back from expressing more wonderfully.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting here, I think too, just to kind of deepen our conversation is, I think of the scriptural tradition as one of those checks and balances because we can gain, we can deepen our understanding, our conceptual understanding. We can reference it against, texts and commentaries that have been vetted to a certain extent. It's not just random, and yet, what's so beautiful, I think, as you were naming that, of course, the lineage of realization, as we normally define it, that second type you were talking about, that's usually something very internal, but it gets expressed through human behavior, because we're in the human world. It gets expressed through human culture. It gets expressed and through all kinds of things in our human lives, and that can change, that can adapt. And I think that's what's so, to me, that unification, that union of that lineage is not some static, how do you say it, dogmatic, fixed kind of like stodgy thing. It's actually able to change in how it expresses itself. What it's expressing, I think, doesn't change in a way, because, emptiness and all these four qualities, those are changeless, they're beyond change. I would say, if you feel free to jump in there if you want on that point, but I think that's quite beautiful how, when we really look at the essence here, it's like, there's a changelessness that then can express itself fluidly in different circumstances and cultures. Like we were just at this event, with Dzongkso Khyentse Rinpoche, and just the way things were expressed was so diverse and full, and the communication that was happening was so rich and nuanced and not just verbal, all kinds of stuff. And yet it's so unique to other ways, what I would consider realized beings, how they form that environment. And they're both great. It's not like there's a competition. And yet they both have this flavor based in the scriptural tradition and, of course, Himalayan Buddhism. So it's interesting. I think of like jazz like that. There's a container for the history of the music and what you're doing. But jazz, the word jazz could mean like so many things now. We say jazz music is like, you could have some guy playing like super abstract, ambient music, but like but he's trained in the history of jazz. There's some thread that connects it back to the tradition. So I think it's similar in our Himalayan Buddhist lineages. But anyways, a lot there. I'd love to hear what you, if you have any of that spark something for you.
Yeah, there's a lot there. It's beautiful. So okay.
I guess we're still on the scriptural
and
The
religious
lineage being
approach,
a scriptural side, and
realization.
then a lived realization side. Yeah. So
Yeah, the Long and Tokpa, scripture and realization. Yeah, those two aspects of lineage. Yeah. So I think it's normal to think of the realization component to actually be interior or subjective, a felt sense. And I think in part that's true. But I think also I would say that it's actually just a more subtle, it's all more subtle connections. It's a lot of the layers that we typically glance over or that we're not yet available to be receptive to. So, and these don't have to just be internal, because it doesn't just have to, of course, they say the bodhisattva levels, as we're becoming more wise and more compassionate, as we're seeing more cause, condition, and effect, clearly, accurately, we go through these bhumis or these levels. And that as we do that, then they say that's largely an internal stage process of development or of opening, you could say, of a revealing the more and more of our Buddha nature. So it's less and less clogged up. And all these miraculous things start turning on. They're usually called siddhis, or these certain extra cognitive abilities where we can see farther, hear clearer, think and remember more expansively with a lot more accuracy and detail. And these are just natural capacities of the mind and the heart when they're not as blocked up with our egoic, self-absorbed, I'm so awesome stuff. And it's not only internal, because a lot of also what these bhumi bodhisattvas, these high level realized bodhisattvas are, they're working on levels and dimensions in ways that are just basically imperceptible to most normal everyday cognition, human beings. But every now and then we get a glimmer or a glance behind that or into that. We peek into a way of seeing, a way of being that's well beyond our normalized way. For me, it goes beyond it. There's kind of an opening. My Buddha nature turns on and shines out more brightly. So for example, when I first came to Padma Samye Ling in upstate New York, I had been doing Goenka Vipassana for about 3.5 years, but I hadn't looked into Tibetan Buddhism at all. And I thought when I got to this Tibetan Buddhist center, everyone was going to be wearing Burmese longi skirts, and they weren't. The men were going to be on one side, the women were going to be on another side of the temple. No, it's all mixed. Guys were wearing shorts. I was shocked. Like, it was different. There's a different cultural setup here. And so that was shocking and kind of a little fresh and opening for me. And instead of being reactive and against it, I was like curious and like, okay, here's a different way this culture, this game, this system can be. So the next day, this is the second or first full day into being around a Tibetan Buddhist scene. First time I'm going to meet Tibetan Buddhist teachers. It's here. And it's these Tibetan Buddhist teachers. So there's an empowerment in the morning. I didn't know what that was. Everyone's walking, circumambulating, walking around the temple. Inside, I can hear these bells ringing, and there's some incense burning outside, and it's kind of dewy, misty mountain morning. Walking around the temple, and I happen to then people start streaming inside of the temple, the main hallway, and I happen to be at the end of the line. And as I'm going into this hallway, it's all these painted hallway walls, and I'm just ready. I'm just like ready for what this is, because once I do this, I can't go to longer going a 10-day course. You basically have to go back to square one and start kind of accumulating your time at that tradition. But I'm ready and I'm available, and I came here to fully see what's going to happen. And so I walk in the hall and I'm just like totally open-eyed and just ready. And I look at the mural painting in the hall, and all of a sudden, just looking down the hall, the wall itself does this giant wave. And the whole painting, it's as if someone dropped a big stone in the wall and it was a pond and it just waved. And I was like totally sober, totally there. And it was just like, oh, that's something. And then I go into the room. Someone puts some yellow liquid in my hand and I drink it. It ends up being saffron water. It's very traditional, typical in Tibetan Buddhism. And we go through this big empowerment ceremony for a couple hours, mainly in Tibetan. There's some explanation in English. I didn't know almost anything, what was going on, but I was totally open for it. Okay, so the end of that beautiful summer day, we're having a picnic outside in front of the temple. Everyone's milling around. Little kids are running. It's like almost like family. It's so beautiful. Cloudless sky. Beautiful. And then someone just points up at the sky, says, "Oh, hey, look." Rinpoches are there. Everyone turns, looks. Right directly above the center of the temple is a double rainbow.
Yeah.
Directly above the temple, a double, completely round circular rainbow straight above the center spire of the temple in a cloudless sky. And like a whole sphere circle.
Yeah.
And at that point, I'm like, all right, this isn't just some felt experience.
Yeah.
It's not just oh, wow, I feel like some power. Like literal things in actual shared common perception are changing in ways that multiple people simultaneously see. So there's something more to this. And when certain little things like that, certain openings happening, all they do is help me, at least for me, suspend disbelief a little bit. Maybe I don't have a full description or understanding of what is happening. And with that, a little bit of a curious open-mindedness, that's the play space of Vajrayana. And that's the play space in the middle way. And it's also the play space of Theravada, to see more fully of reality. Yeah. And to not to pop that bubble of, I know what's going on. I'm so self-convinced that my story is the complete story. And it's just not. And so helpful shared outer things that happen like that are very valuable on the path, not so we can be all kind of swept away in the magic of it all. And there's a lot of magic to enjoy and to celebrate and love, but it's more the magic of just not being so self-certain.
Yeah.
Of just being in awe.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think there's this whole element of, you know, I've talked about it before, of like, very little of our human experience is communicated through words, actually, and voice. Much of it is not. And as you pointed out, Buddhist lineage, Buddhism lineages are there to help us connect with those other layers of communication. And then, of course, as you're describing, beyond human communication and human environment, where actual, reality and the way we perceive it starts to bend. And, this is, I think we're pointing out just many reasons on the power of lineage, because in that, as you started to say, it's not like, for me, there's not like, of course, it's nice and it's very uplifting to be like, to connect with a little bit of magic, something I don't know the reasons for, but it's kind of blowing my mind. That's a nice experience. But I think the deeper, as you're pointing out, the real deeper message, the real deeper power is that it bends our mind. It's still, as you were saying, it like stops our reification of, momentarily, of like what we believe and what we think as being correct and true. And, again, just for some listeners who are maybe not Buddhist, but Buddhist curious, it's not then that like, I think the Buddhist lineages are trying to convince you of their truth. No, we're just trying to open, it's just trying to open up processes to question truth in general, and to start to move the mind out of such a fixated, rigid, way of being. But the problem is, myself included, we don't know when we're being rigid and fixated, and when we're limiting ourselves and our potential, we don't know it until someone kind of points it out, or something happens, so like the double rainbow sphere you were talking about, or something like that. And then, for some people, it's psychedelics takes them out of that phase momentarily, but unfortunately, usually the rigidity reasserts itself shortly after. So I think, to me, we're just describing all these ways. I just want to summarize it real quick for the listeners and watchers here. We're really describing the power of lineage. Why, for you and I, this is such a beautiful and deep rabbit hole we've sort of thrown our life into, but also that we promote and that we're interested in exploring personally, but we also want to help others, expose themselves to. And I just want to be really clear, that has nothing to do with belief. It's something very different, All right.
It's tricky.
It's tricky. I'm not saying there aren't beliefs. I'm just saying there are beliefs in Buddhism.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that to me, there's a difference between a belief pointing you to the belief itself and it ends at the belief, and a belief pointing you beyond belief. There's
totally.
There's a difference. Yeah. And I think that's the power of Buddhist lineages. Yeah. They point beyond belief.
Yeah. So there's fundamentalism.
Yeah.
It's unwilling to be questioned. Then there's questioning, which its whole thing is inquiring, skepticism, a healthy skepticism. Look, parse, edit, like really see it how it's been filtered. And then the third thing is transformative contemplation. It's not just seeing the history of something, it's actually ingesting it, absorbing it, testing something, seeing, like do the lab experiment. It means you have to actually make the commitment to do the experiment and show up in the turn, create a lab condition and actually do the test. And that's a commitment. That's a responsibility. And then you get a result, and then you have to check the result with other people who did the same test in the same way. That's just called good science. And in the meditative approach, that's called transformative path or practice. That's meditative, like actualization, or that's how we use scripture as statements to test. And as we test them, we get a result. And that result, when it's confirmed and corroborated, when we get more of a clear certainty around it, because we've tested it more, we've compared it more, and we get not an absolutized, rigid, fixated, dogmatic certainty, but we get a certainty that, like, if we really show up for context carefully, we will see this specific type of element or result happen. And that's just being thoroughly scientific. Buddhism just says that doesn't stop with empirical investigation. There is empirical science, there's rationality, there's very specific analytic models that if we use them well, we'll actually create better working models, better tests. We'll get better results that are actually evidenced more widely by a greater diversity of experimentation. And that's like a more full version of truth. But we never get to a fundamentalist, literalist truth and then stop. It always can be pushed further and opened further to have more of its internested richness be exposed and enjoyed. But we don't endlessly just keep peeling. We actually have to do the work to absorb it into our way of being, so that it's not just a question of knowing the diversity of options on the table or having a lot of stories to tell. It becomes, how can I be with you in a way that syncs up, that's really helpful and supportive for you too? So I'll tell this story. So I'll listen in this way. And so that poise of mind and openness of heart, that kind of openness, that's lineage happening. That's being in the living funnel, like fount of lineage blessing, when we're so open and poised to actually be in living communication with cause, condition, and effect, including with others. And that means we're mutually responding with them in ways that are omni-beneficial. They're supported, we're supported, self and other, both relatively, temporarily, with happiness, health, well-being, protection, and ultimately with enlightenment, with actual liberation from suffering and the causes of suffering. And that's lineage. Lineage will do all that in Buddhism, but it does require beliefs, because we do have to, at least temporarily, hold a position long enough to do the experiment. But we're testing the position to see how it's just temporary and it works in certain circumstances, but when those change, we might get a different result.
Totally agree with you. And, just to say it kind of a way I've been thinking about it lately is, I think what's unique about, we're talking about Buddhist lineages here, or the Buddhist path, is it explicitly, I don't know, for me at least, I think it's explicit. It kind of lets you know this is something you are testing, this is something you're testing your perception, appearance, and habit patterns and ideas off of. Another way to think of that is, like, it's explicit that you're bouncing your ideas and human experience and self off of something else.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Where I think
Okay.
there's not a lot of things that do that. You know, there's a lot of belief systems that they don't explicitly tell you that. They just say, believe this, you know, do this. And I think that's not only attractive for a lot of us, it's incredibly powerful because it's like it's teaching us how to think. It's teaching us how to be curious, how to be open from the get-go, right? So that's kind of how I think of it. Because yeah, there are beliefs like, you know, and some of them are way more challenging to come to a certainty on, like karma, cause, and effect is a very difficult thing to come to some certainty on. But we might not start there. We might start with some other beliefs. And then, you know, we start to realize we have a belief. I think for so many people, there's not even this acknowledgement or you know, how do you say it? Acknowledgement or awareness that there's a belief happening. I think just even that something that points us to the fact that we have beliefs is actually quite important, you know, let alone questioning those beliefs.
Yeah, we recently heard we're aiming to try to go beyond all theory. The only people who've gone beyond all theory are enlightened beings.
Yeah.
Which means in the meantime, on the path, we're going to have to use theory. Theory, beliefs, statements of fact, approximate depictions, stories. They're currently called stories. And we are story-making monkeys. And we have limbic systems of reptilian brain stems. And we want to fall in love. We want to fall in love with music, with food, with places, with people, we want to get swept away in it. And it's totally a superpower of humans. Because instead of having to understand all the mechanics of a situation, how is a song designed, how is the movie been edited, we could just suspend disbelief and let ourselves be taken away. We enjoy the magic trick.
Yeah.
The trick is to remember it's a magic trick.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
And to enjoy it. And it's just a story. It's just a story. This person, this lovely experience, a lovely afternoon, a lovely time. It's so wonderful to just surrender and just literally we relax. We become vulnerable, curious, interested. We are highlighting the good things that we see instead of all the bad things. So we let ourselves really strongly, more fully sync up with our local container. We get a lot of good feedback. We make ourselves vulnerable to that. And that's a falling in love process. The problem is we actually do have to learn some degree of the mechanics of the situation too. How does this work? Is this a good judgment? Like, am I being tricked? Is someone trying to sell me something? So we do need to have this also a larger vision where we can let ourselves be vulnerable, but to do so in a really intelligent way that's actually trying to check itself and check the environment and to see, is everything here happening in a healthy way? So we can avoid using theory and ideas and beliefs, but there's a difference in Buddhism. There's unhealthy beliefs, there's healthy beliefs, and then there's going beyond belief.
Yeah.
So there's negative grasping, positive grasping, non-grasping. Oftentimes it's talked about as non-virtue. That's negative grasping. Virtue is positive grasping. Wisdom is non-grasping. So the great Jamyang Khaltrul Rinpoche said, the ground is the two truths, relative and absolute. Relationality in endless, inexhaustible pattern sequences that are empty, they're open, they're endless. The path is merit and wisdom. That's positive grasping and non-grasping.
Yeah.
The result is the two kayas, the form and formless bodies. So tangible, expressive, kind of like how Buddha nature is in a more tangible way, and how it is in a semi-tangible and a formless way. So a Rupakaya and a Rupakaya, or a tangible kind of expression of enlightened energy and less tangible expressions of enlightened energy. So the point is, the path always requires merit and wisdom, relative and absolute, and good grasping. That means don't do bad stuff, do good stuff. That's good grasping. Tame the mind. That's wisdom. non-grasping, go beyond conditioned mind and all of its belief, habit structures, and reference points.
Yeah.
But if we just use ideas about being referenceless
Yeah.
and abiding in space, and I'm going to fly in the Dzogchen sky and things like this, but we don't actually have lineage that's helped us fully absorb that totally spontaneous, all-inclusive, complete way of being, then we're going to actually be just aiming for a 1 or 2 stories that we have tucked inside that we don't yet see is like running the show as an operating system inside. And that blind spot is going to hijack our complete path to enlightenment at some point, and probably sooner than later. And probably a lot of other people will see it way before we see it. And we'll be that dude who's all non-dual, oneness, everything. But most people think we're just a jerk.
Yeah.
And that's very preventable. We've seen that happen, especially amongst charismatic white guys, for about 60 or 70 years in the United States now. So from one white guy to another, let's not let that happen to each other.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, how do you say it? Yeah, I like everything you said there. And I think there's always this process of like, for me, there's this sense of like a growing merit is also, I think, an ability to grow understanding and experience of the Dharma and expanding that. And so, you know, I have this idea of like high level ping pong, where it's sort of just like, then when I'm bouncing off of something in the Dharma, that's deepening as I'm bouncing off of it. But I'm also getting feedback, just as you were saying, just another way to put it. Like I'm getting feedback on like, hey, am I in line with virtue or not? You know? And the more mindfulness we practice, the quicker that feedback comes, actually. You know, we get feedback quicker. And that's a really beautiful and beneficial thing. So yeah, for sure. I mean, I hope that's clear. You know, for me, I think going beyond belief kind of takes belief first. But for me, there's a big difference in sort of the longing or the aspiration to go beyond belief. There's a big difference between like adopting beliefs or ping-ponging or bouncing off beliefs and working with them as a process, as ways of curiosity into a path, into lineage, practicing them, meditating on them, contemplating them, etc., trying to understand them deeper over many years. There's a big difference with like, there's still that longing to kind of taste that the completeness of going beyond belief, of that, you know, to taste that naturalness, right? That doesn't have to land anywhere. And I think that's one of the very unique parts, you know, of Buddhism, is it's sort of like, well, we're simultaneously longing for something we can't actually touch. Because as you were just, you know, very, very wisely pointing out, even if we talk all this non-dual stuff or sort of get into these non-dual traditions within Buddhism or, you know, without, in another non-dual tradition, it all just can become concept very easily. And it's just a nice concept. It doesn't really do anything. You know, it's just a nice concept, a nice party trick, you know, a nice way to build some other kind of ego, you know? And so I think this is kind of the interesting part, is when there's, as you were saying, I'm just sort of rethinking, I'm thinking in a different way and just sharing it in another way to hopefully add, hopefully not take away from our conversation. Is like, it's also really important. There's a container. There's beliefs that we temporarily take on because they're in line with relative truth. They're in line with what's going to do less harm to, you know, towards ourselves and others. They're in line with creating less of a weight or burden of karmic habitual patterns that's going to cause problems for us. And I think there's, you know, but while that's happening, there's also the longing to go beyond belief. That I think is very unique. Yeah. That's something I really love about Buddha Dharma.
Yeah. It's exquisite. Yeah. It's very, very unique and very exquisite. So to use belief to actually dissolve the fixation of belief is wonderful. To the fact that belief, we could talk about this also as view or tawa, a worldview. Worldviews have ways of orienting reality. They have like operating principles, values. They have do's and don'ts. Every worldview comes with an entire landscape and world that it operates within. That's how worldviews work.
Yeah.
You could call it like a game, the worldview of playing tennis. There's boundaries to that game. How many players? How do you win? How do you lose? How do you step out of bounds? Are you better at a backhand or a forehand? All of a sudden, there's a lot of rich qualities, metrics, patterns that turn on when that story, that bounded system, that ecology of tennis is agreed upon to be played. But that's a belief system. It's a worldview. And you can then dissolve that belief system and change it and play basketball. And you can dissolve it and change it and play soccer. And the 9 yana, the 9 vehicle system in Nyingma Tibetan Buddhism is like this. You play a smaller game that's about me and ending my suffering. And it becomes a larger game of ending your suffering and my suffering and all beings suffering. And then you play to a larger game of doing that with all kinds of more extensive, subtle, skillful means, using all kinds of variety of human experience of different capacities, intellectual ones, emotional ones, felt ones, near ones, far ones. So it's a path of skillful means. And that path, that's just a bigger game. And eventually then you go beyond that and more maha, more inclusive, more complete, where it's not even having to frame a system around certain conceptual beliefs. So this is a 9 yana system and how it expands to include more of reality, but it's constantly going beyond itself, not by making fun of or throwing out of the smaller game or the smaller story ways of believing, the ways of actually loving life and grieving and playing games, having stories, having culture. It doesn't throw them out. It honors them. And it says, this goes deeper and further as well. If you're interested, feel free. And it keeps extending that and extending that. And the function we're trying to actually allow for is the ability to flex flow between games. It's not to get to a final game. It's not to get to a final dream. It's always going to be internested dreams. It's the ability to move between dream scenarios depending on what's helpful for someone else. And if we temporarily adopt their dream, their belief system, their values in a way that actually would support them to be more courageous, more fearless, more content, whatever it would be, we support that game as if it's true. With a larger view of it being able to dissolve into a larger game. And then we're also putting ourselves at the mercy of people who can play bigger games in more elegant ways. And we're trying to learn from these bigger, more expert people so we can become even more responsive, elegant, fluid, graceful beings, like for the benefit of others. And the point here that I didn't want to forget is mindfulness is a key factor to see what is my mind doing? What is my heart doing? At the same time, it can never just be extracted from the living lineage ecology because it's part of a suite of different factors. There's right mindfulness, right livelihood, right thought, right view, right speech. And this is an entire ecology that the Buddha taught. And if we only pull one feature of an ecology as if we can just take it in a non-distorted way, that's definitely called an oppressive colonial move, for sure. That's just going into a local setting, grabbing what we like and running. And that we all know is not a good thing to do. And in Buddhism, it breaks lineage because it doesn't have any sets of checks and balances anymore. It's just mindfulness. Why? Because a sharpshooter is very mindful, but are they compassionate? Are they using their mindfulness for compassion? And so that's quite different. Mindful and caring, mindful and compassionate.
Yeah, I think this is why I wanted to kind of have this conversation of what lineage is within Tibetan Buddhism and why lineage, because it sets us up when we talk about why lineage. And I hope this came across, in our conversation to those of you listening out there. It has a view. It has something that we're trying to get used to. It has an aim, something we're longing for. We've used different language here, Dragpa and I. And I think that I really like, oh, by the way, I don't want to forget this. If it's okay with you to go a little longer, I'd love to use that as what you were just describing as an ecology issue, as a segue into discussing briefly, what are some threats to preserving lineage. Because I think we're making the case that it's important to preserve lineage. What lineage is, why, and then the why also implicitly starts to show some importance that in order to, I hope for some of you out there, you're starting to see our own fixation and rigidity. Once we recognize that, it's like it's a prison we're in, and no one put us in that prison. It's a prison of our own making in our own mind. And as you so beautifully just said, to be able to expand, to see others' needs, and to play different games at higher levels, and to be able to fluidly move through games, meaning life experiences, how to meet others, how to meet them at levels that actually will help them to liberate, not just feel better, not just, how do you say it, soothe something temporarily, but ultimately, that's a big deal. I think it's a whole paradigm shift of how we have to think. I find this to be a case because often even the word bodhicitta, and this is maybe one way to start our conversation on some of the possible dangers to lineage. I'm really concerned how the word bodhicitta is being misused, in Western Buddhism and Western Dharma, because it seems like it's sort of, it's very difficult, as to actually understand bodhicitta, let alone embody it. But we read the words, and it seems like, oh, well, just be a good person, and that's bodhicitta. But that's not really what it's talking about. Of course, that's included because it's a basic human value. Like you're saying, we take the smaller circle with us as the circle expands. So the smaller circle is just being a kind human being. It's not Buddhist or religious or spiritual at all. It's just being a kind human being as a basic value. Bodhicitta is something much bigger. And so I think this is some of the dangers I see, and then I'll just use that as a segue into some things you're thinking of like, the misuse of terms. I often call it the colonization of terms, like where, you pull mindfulness out of the ecology of the deeper lineages and paths, and then it becomes this thing that has no view. And bodhicitta as a term also gets pulled out, and it's this thing that has no view. It's sort of, it gets caught up in like, how do you say it? Becoming a more likable person, or having some kind of effect based on doing rather than being, So I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts, but that's what I've been thinking about lately, how these things get misused often these days. And feel free to go wherever you want. I was just using that as a, on this larger question.
I think the sheer scope and power of bodhicitta is clear in my mind in the case of dying. So when we say we're going experience to kind of a longer process of dying, the Buddhist teachings say that's at that point during that time, all the ways that we've made sense of life, of our sense of self, they start to stop. We can't control what we hear. Our body feels heavy. We can't really, we start to not be able to move our limbs. Our mind starts to move in ways that aren't usual for ourselves. Our vision might get dull. So the thing is that at this critical juncture, when all the usual ways that we know ourselves, that we've actually embedded ourselves in our story, what we see, what we think, what we hear, what we remember, all that stuff starts to get out of our control, and we can do nothing about it. That's when bodhicitta, the question of, is bodhicitta there or not? Has bodhicitta just been about me making a nice story? Because my mind starts to get erratic and I can't even remember who I am. I don't even remember who you are. What are you doing by my bed? Why can't I move my body? And it starts to panic because all the ways that I thought were me are actually I'm not in control of, and I'm still there watching the whole show. And at that point, if I've trained in bodhicitta, then even though this is out of my control and it's not making much sense, if my heart is open and loving and connected and courageous and bright and deeply concerned about how are you, and has a surge of kind of the vital connective energy of being aware. That is bodhicitta. And it's not in a certain shape or size or form or performance. It's actually when my mind is settled and relaxed and it allows for its own natural capacities to turn on. They don't have to show up in some certain way according to what I want. They're trying to actually show up with what's helpful in a situation. And I don't get to control the situation. And when I'm dying, I won't get to control it. And so that's like a good case of like, that shows like, well, what's the quality of wisdom and compassion am I talking about? When I can't control anything, it's not going my way. Insert your Pema Chodron title here.
Yeah, there's no like conscious thought going on, you know, as the death process. We lose the ability to think critically. So, you know, we're talking about another mind, you know, another mind that is open beyond any kind of conceptual basis. But also, as you're saying, is you know, poised to the needs of others and has that. You know, there's one quote that sums this up for me from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He says, we help because help is needed, not because we want to help. And I think there's a big difference. You know, it shows the kind of vow of the Bodhisattva. And again, what is the help that's ultimately needed? It's that, you know, we have, you know, the Bodhisattva's aim is to wake people up from their dream. You know, of course, it's to also help to make that dream less of a nightmare while they're in a dream, but that's not the main purpose. The main purpose is to wake people up out of the dream. And that's the part that I think gets missed a lot of the time, that along with making the nightmare less of a nightmare, we also, you know, the Bodhisattva also has to create the specific interdependent circumstances for that person to recognize it's a dream. That's the most important thing. Because again, it's sort of like when we really, you know, develop that compassion where help is needed, we have to plumb very deeply into understanding people, understanding ourselves, understanding what suffering is, you know, hence the four seals and all of that. So I think it's just, I don't want to get bogged down here though, because I also do want to hear what you have to say about some threats to lineage in the modern world, because I know you know, you had some good stuff to say about that. But anyways, sorry to this is a rich topic for me, this bodhicitta one.
Yeah, it's really rich, and it's related to a threat that's definitely around Vajrayana lineage, and it's definitely related to bodhicitta, and it has a lot to do with what's called pure relative truth. Because also part of the stories that we're not yet available for, or that we're marginalizing, you could say, a lot of those stories are non-human centered stories. They're non-analytic, non-logical, non-linear stories. And these ways of being embedded, embodied, enmeshed, extended, communicative, there's a lot of different ways to be and do and become in this whole thing called life and death, you know? And so Buddha called this very clearly. You could go to Mipar Rinpoche's teachings. On the relative level, there's impure relative truth and pure relative truth. Impure relative truth is how duality beings are basically lost in the nightmare web of their confusion. Pure relative truth is how beings who are actually abiding in the openness of their heart and mind and emptiness, they start to see in a more refined way. Their vision, their sounds, their smells, the taste, the cognition starts to be enhanced. It starts to be refined. And so they start to see patterns, layers, connection, cause and condition that isn't filtered through duality, dense nightmare lensing. It's more refined than that. And that's called pure relative truth. And this is what all the tantras assume. In addition to abiding in emptiness, the openness of mind and heart, then there's Buddha nature, which starts to turn on and become, when it's empty of other, empty of its adventitious kind of clogging mechanisms, it starts to be fully expressive of its Buddha nature qualities. And this starts to shine on entire world systems of pure relative truth. That's called tantras. And there's 6 vehicles of tantras. Fourth, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. It's outer tantras and inner tantras. And here's where we highlight something that's very much, even amongst Buddhists, even amongst Tibetan Buddhists, this is very much in jeopardy. Pure relative truth. Soksar Khyentse Rinpoche emphasized this quite a lot. and he has before a long time. And one succinct way to talk about this is Zen is not the same as Dzogchen. The third yana vehicle of Bodhisattva yana is not the same as the ninth yana vehicle of Ati Yoga Mahasandhi.
Yeah,
it's
by
not
vehicle, we could use the other word, just path for some people.
Path, or you could call it a worldview.
Sure.
The whole worldview and world space of a view, meditation, conduct, and fruition. A whole internested way of making sense and being and becoming. So one of the significant differences between Zen, which is amazing, and Dzogchen, which is really amazing, is called pure relative truth.
Mm.
And in terms of middle way Madhyamaka, throwing a bunch of terms in here, but in terms of the middle way view of poising the mind for open, responsive, kind of connective emptiness abiding, is called pure body and pure speech. That's often talked about as deity and mantra. Pure mind is called Dharmakaya mind, or it's called Zen mind, beginner's mind, no mind, the mind of the great Tao. Pure mind is very similar in Zen and Dzogchen. This is what Great Nippon Rinpoche says. But the pure body and pure speech, that is a definitive difference in between Sutra, Tantra. And so this great Karma Chagme said in Union of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, pure body and pure speech, or deity and mantra, that is the main difference between Sutra and Tantra. And these things, deity and mantra, this is typically being erased from Dzogchen.
Mm.
And from all these tantras, and Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche mentioned this a lot. He said Mahasandhi is not just, or I'm not going to repeat what he said, but it's not just be here now.
Yeah.
There are entire world systems of pure relative truth, of worlds, of beings, of communications, of patterns, of histories, of interactive species. This is, the tantras and the sutras are filled with this stuff. And oftentimes this is extracted from living lineage as if it's pre-modern superstition.
Yeah.
And it's thrown in the bin of indigenous pre-modern wisdom. And that has been a move that's utterly destroying the wisdom lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. And that should be defended against, because no Dzogchen master said what you need to do is remove the tantras and then you have Dzogchen. None of them say that. You can't remove the tantras. You can't remove the sutras. It's great completion. It includes all the Tekpa vehicle yana systems, because if you exclude any way of communicating with beings, you're not a bodhisattva.
Mm.
You're going to say, I'll help all these beings except the beings that believe in sutra. I won't help them at all, you know? That's fundamentally breaks a bodhisattva vow. Or all the non-Buddhists. Oh, I won't help them. That fundamentally breaks a bodhisattva vow. You have to help everybody with whatever's helpful, any game, any belief system, any value structure, and you have to flexibly move between the value structures because their nature is emptiness. It's naturally flexible. So this point's big, and it's definitely happening in the so-called Wilberian integral communities, largely because a lot of the people there they're not in Vajrayana lineage. They're reading books and they're studying it. And it's scripture only lineage. They're not in an actual living lineage container around a teacher that's keeping them in check and actually helping them grow in certain ways that you can't read about in a book. And because of that, a lot of the pure relative truth tantras are being removed from Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism as if that's doing a favor to the lineage. And it's not. It'll kill it. And any authentic Vajrayana lineage master, name a name. His Holiness Dalai Lama, His Holiness Karmapa, His Holiness Sakya Tristan, His Holiness Penna Rinpoche, His Holiness Dujin Rinpoche, His Holiness Dugwa Khyentse Rinpoche. All these masters, they want to fully include Theravada, sutras, tantras, Dzogchen. The whole system has to be included for the living lineage wisdom of Vajrayana to stay intact, not just the part that they like the best. That is a sectarian approach, and they're all definitively, unanimously against those kind of sectarian approaches to Buddha Dharma.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you pointing this out in this kind of way. To me, this kind of, I mean, you're specifying something, but it goes into this basket of, I think the larger threat is an unwillingness to come out of our lens, our modern materialist, reasoning based lens and try to see that there's other ways to look at things, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's sort of like if we can't look at something that's not ours, meaning like Buddhism generally has not been held by Western culture at all until, you know, this attempt recently.
Mm-hmm.
So I always feel, you know, I mean, I've always had this approach. We have to, not only are we a student, we're a foreigner, you know, we're a tourist, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
We're a foreigner, and we have to never forget we're a foreigner. And I'm not saying this is somewhere where we diminish ourselves and, I'm never going to be Tibetan and all that. It's not saying that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, saying I know you get it. I'm just kidding. I'm concerned for some watching or listening here. It's not saying that. It's saying we are with humility. We are willing to be a foreigner, and keeping this thought. I'm a foreigner to, you know, this lineage, coming from a different culture, a different ecosystem, different worldview. Mm-hmm. That we can start to see our lenses of our own worldview and see how not all of our Western lenses are bad. You know, some of them are quite helpful, but some of them are harmful in this way, where if we decide to dilute, take out, you know, augment prematurely until we have unchanging realization. You know, once we get some Westerners, maybe they're already here, they probably already are, with unchanging realization, we're going to have some ways for, you know, scripture and realization to come through Western culture in very unique ways that don't lose the essence. You know, I do believe that we'll have some of that, but until that's established, not just 1 or 2 or 10 or 30 people, or let's say even hundreds, until that's established, we run the risk of diluting and you know, all of the things you're talking about. So I love how you brought it to pure relative, but to me, there's also got to be this understanding of why that even takes place. You know, what is the mechanism, you know, which I just call colonialism. But like I said, you know, what is specific to modern, you know, I know it's a rabbit hole you and I can continue to go in, because we could take like a postmodern lens and see how that also can be harmful to some of these things. But yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it would be interesting. I'd love to hear from you also on some of these more general things of lens that's unseen, that, you know, affects how this becomes diluted and possibly dismantled in a harmful way. You know, lineage, let's say, Vajrayana lineage. Yeah.
Well, personally, there's 2 things that are very low-hanging fruit that don't require any belief in anything magical or mystical. And one is current cognitive science. There is much more than a type of knowledge, or you could just call it's called 4E cognitive science. And it's analytic thinking, or IQ, is no longer the only value of intelligence. There's also participatory knowledge, procedural knowledge, perspectival knowledge, in addition to propositional knowledge, logic. This is proven very strongly in cognitive science currently. So you have to be able to take multiple perspectives, learn skill sets, have participatory knowledge to where it's shaped by the living local context. It's not just something you put onto it. These are proven empirically, rationally, Eurocentrically proven ways that the human brain-mind structure functions, embedded according to the current science. It's not just a thinking machine. We're not just thoughts. So that's one. That means we have to go beyond mere empiricism and rationality, because that's what current science says, that's how we function. 2, in addition to that, like strictly empirical rational thing, then we know it's postmodernism. We have feelings, we have stories, we have all these culturally encoded biases. And biases can be good and biases can be super destructive. Healthy biases help us sort an infinite set of data in a visual field in a minute. It helps bottleneck it into the most relevant stuff happening, like a tiger is jumping at me now. Like, I don't process 1,000 bits of data to see what the tiger's body movement is. I recognize tiger, danger, run.
Yeah.
Like, that is a way of chunking of this, called relevance realization in cognitive science. And our body and mind structure does do that. And it chunks in this way. It takes a giant, pretty much inexhaustible amount of data, and it cognitively selects for the things that are most relevant right now. And that's a healthy bias. If we didn't do that, we could never do anything. And so this way of functioning, these are like basically additional ways that are not traditionally thought of as IQ intelligence. They're how do we move through different types, different ways of problem solving to become a general problem solver. This is actually relevant to AI. They say this is the thing that if artificial intelligence can actually learn, if they can train it, or it can train itself to do general problem solving, then it will become, there'll be no reasonable person who can say it's not sentient. Because if it can read poetry and look at a stoplight and give advice to a kid and also tell you what's inside of a recipe, if it can just seamlessly move between problem sets the way humans typically do, that's called general intelligence. It's multi-strategy problem solving, like naturally, easily. And so this is the second point. Artificial intelligence is about to hand humans their lunch. Because just on the IQ line in that ChatGPT-3 by OpenAI company, it went from having 130 IQ to 150 IQ in 3 months. That means it's currently in the top 1 percentile of passing any different exam that you can give it. A law exam, any IQ exam, it's the top 1% now, all above all the other humans who've taken years of study. It did that in 3 months. So it's currently on the way to be about 180 IQ. Einstein's IQ was 160. So what this means is everyday humans like me and the super genius IQ humans like Einstein are about to not understand the IQ of ChatGPT 4 or 5. And so we're about to be like at the limit of our empirical rationality. It's about to be having to teach us how to do stuff. All right. Literally, like it might have already happened. And it doesn't have to even be sentient to do that. It just means humans are about to become not the top of the food chain anymore. At least in terms of IQ, it's about to know how to process things in ways that we cannot even yet imagine. And it's not because it's a fish or a turtle and it's that dumb. It's because we're that dumb. And we can't understand the imaginative ways that it's functioning yet. That's why the best chess players, the best human chess players, are studying the AIs to teach them how to do better chess. So that puts us in a really humble position as humans currently, specifically related to these really subtle currents of cause, condition, and effect. It doesn't yet have to be pure relative truth, but it should definitely give really intelligent academic humans, like ones that go to Oxford and, talk about the secularization of Buddhism as if they're doing it a big favor. It's about to show those specific people that they need to get a lot more humble a lot more quickly, because this thing, AI, is about to beat every single human and every different IQ challenge that we can imagine. And humans won't understand how it's happening. We'll only know that it did it. It won.
Yeah. So you're actually, thinking or reasoning like a positive use case of AI in that sense, where it's sort of like, it's going to educate us. I actually have that kind of optimism too, because
I think, go ahead.
I mean, there's some huge dangers. We're not going to get to that in this conversation, but let's just
the dangers are the dangers of the humans using the AI.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's the danger. But
because but I think there's that movie. What's that movie? It was kind of a commentary exactly on this. The one where Her with Joaquin Phoenix,
and Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, where like at some point the AI's got so much intelligence, they was just like, bye, like we're going somewhere. It's like where are you going? We can't explain this to you, like you won't understand it, basically, And
just like Bhumi Bodhisattvas have to do with us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like just like Guru Rinpoche had to do with Yeshe Sojal. Yeshe Sojal is an enlightened being. But at a certain point, Yeshe Sojal is like, will you show me just a little bit of the Sambhogakaya realms? Pure relative truth realms. How do these high Bhumi Bodhisattvas experience worlds? And Guru Rinpoche said, no, you're not ready. And she said, oh, great master. Well, like, will you please just show me? And he said, okay, fine, just a tiny bit. And he like snapped his fingers and he let her own cognitive intelligence open to see like the vast vistas of Sambhogakaya vision. And she instantly fainted.
Yeah.
Because it was so imaginatively explosive and powerful. And this is what happens every time we die.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because all of our habits of ways of like making reality digestible to me, because I want the kids menu, all that stuff, it shuts off, and the full spectrum power of reality beams straight into my mind. And if my mind can't handle that amount of power without trying to collapse it into a reference box, it faints.
Mm.
And that's what we do every time we go to sleep. And it's what we do at these different days. So what we're training in to actually be in a mind poised for insight is to be so readily attentive that even if the box moves, even if the patterns shift, even if things get very weird and very liminal and very imaginative, we stay bright and attentive and discerning. And we don't just pass out or fight. Yeah. And that's the training process of meditation in general. And when we can do that more widely, more stably, we'll start to see some patterns that we overlooked. We'll start to see some of the amazing, extraordinary glow of like pure relative truth of how Sambhogakaya beings are, how bodhisattvas function when they're realized, of how the human cognitive ability is when it's not boxed through a tiny little empirical box of thoughts or of my story. But that's when it gets not into ideas, which is modernism basically, hyper ideas, or only my story, that's hyper extreme postmodernism. But post-postmodern or middle way or integral starts to be whatever game's being played, I'm okay, I'm willing to learn. And that's called integral or middle way view. And once we start to be really curious and willing to learn, and those different types of pattern systems and civilizations of worlds and beings and communication styles start to really be allowed by our minds, that's when we start seeing pure relative truth and the relevance of the tantras. And that's when we start taking as a belief. That's when we start believing in the tantras, because we'll start to have confidence that they're more accurate than the current diluted mode of view that I'm holding. So we'll temporarily hold a better belief that we haven't yet earned, because we'll be on a trajectory that the Buddha told me the foundational Buddhism, that turned out to be true. And then he told me Bodhisattva Yana, that turned out to be true. Then he told me Shentong, the Buddha nature, that turned out to be true. Okay, is there a galaxy world system 18 million light years away where all these beings have lifespans of 10,000 years and they constantly just have food fights of generosity to like serve each other and love? Maybe. Yeah. And we start to entertain that as a belief, and not so that I can then define my whole life based on this one dogmatic belief, but I allow myself to, it's a what if state of mind. They call it it's like hypothetical deductive. I allow myself to be in a what if play space. And then all of a sudden, these creative capacities start to have room to gel in new ways. And that's what the tantras do. That's what the skillful means allow for. And that's when Mahasandhi or Ati Yoga has a full range of game playing to serve beings.
Yeah. Well, very complete the way you put it. And, I don't have much to add, but just to sort of maybe cap our conversation, I would say, and that's when we are free, because I don't know about you, as just a normal human being, I need some incentive, and so maybe some of our listeners need some incentive too. That's when we are free and complete, when we know that completeness and we are that completeness. And I think what you're pointing out, which is so helpful, is that completeness is not nothingness. That completeness also comes with an experience, right? We're calling pure relative here in our conversation.
And we can taste it at every moment. Like any moment you're with someone and they genuinely feel seen, and you generally care, you genuinely, like authentically care about them, that is a moment of true nature. That's a moment of bodhicitta. It's a moment of wisdom and compassion, like fully on in that context between those minds. And that is freedom. And then the freedom becomes more full. You share that with two people. You share that in a different context. You share that when you're tired. You share that when you have an empty bank account. You share that when you have a full bank account. And that connective power, like that interdependence where it's like full on, heart to heart, like really all cylinders on, like all the different embodied ways of being a human, of being like your Buddha nature, like of being a Buddha. When that's on, that's a moment of freedom. And it can be simple, so simple. You can just be by yourself sitting, doing nothing, and just being in love with the world.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, my friend, I think it's a really beautiful, note to close our conversation on. I do want to ask you though, if there's anything just we missed that you'd like to close with, but I really feel you that really, what do you say? That dropped the mic. Yeah. But if you want to pick the mic up again, you're welcome to.
Well, I love you, brother.
I love you too, man.
And I appreciate the work you're doing. And I also just appreciate the work of, there's so many wonderful beings in the world. And each of us are those beings. And when we let our hearts like really settle into themselves and we just stop and show up for a moment with someone else and with ourselves too, and just like enjoy the I am me and you are you. And we're breathing and doing this wild thing together. And it's totally mysterious. And no one controls it. Totally. And we're doing our best. And then we try to do our best even better.
Yeah.
And that is the Buddhist path.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, yeah. And we have, you and I never try to proselytize or make someone Buddhist, but I do feel really thankful for these lineages. You and I share a lineage and, the same lineage. And I just feel so thankful for meeting this. Yeah. It's like I don't know. This is where I feel like a lot of us are really lost. And if we're willing to open our heart and, maybe adopt some temporary beliefs, but again, with this longing to really find freedom, which isn't belief, but we might need some temporary beliefs. I think it's just so vital. I think, I think you and I are both very passionate for the preservation of Dharma in the world, more specifically Vajrayana lineage. And it's, it's just so amazing. Every day I feel so more and more appreciative of that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's extraordinary. And if you're not a Buddhist, just recognize one really valuable thing you have in yourself. Yeah. And hopefully, if you're fortunate, find one other person, one other being who can enjoy that with you. And then look for something valuable in them and share that together. And that's the beginning of community. That's the beginning of Sangha. And that's beginning of that is definitely the step to making this world a better place in that small little area, which is the relationship between you and that person, or even me and myself. That is how this goodness comes out. It's how we change the world. It's never been different than that. And you don't need to be a Buddhist to do that, but you do have to care. You have to care about yourself and you have to see the value in others. Even if it's just a sparkle, that's enough. That's all you need to start and really have your heart turn on and have your wisdom start shining. And it's beautiful. I really supplicate everyone to do that. And I'm very thankful for the great beings that have done that. And they constantly do that all the time. And may their lives be very long, very healthy. May their wisdom activities of compassion and love and bodhicitta be endless for the benefit of every single being. And I really dedicate the merit, the virtue for that to happen right now.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Lama Dragpa, it's been a joy to have you on for, now a part 2, a little deeper into lineage. And I would love to do this again. So lots of love, my friend. I really, really enjoy this. So just thank you for coming on, sharing your beautiful wisdom.